When a narcissistic woman asks herself, "Do you still need me to feel whole?" she is not asking out of love or concern. She is testing something far deeper, whether her presence still defines your inner structure. In Jungian terms, this is a question about psychological dependence. The narcissistic personality does not connect through mutual recognition. It connects through attachment that feeds the ego. Your need becomes her proof of existence. Earlier, your attention may have functioned like a mirror. You reflected back the image she wanted to see. Powerful, desired, central. But growth changes the mirror when you begin to individuate, when your sense of self no longer relies on external validation. The narcissist feels destabilized. Not because you are leaving, but because you are becoming whole without her. This is why emotional independence feels like betrayal to a narcissistic mind. If you no longer need her to regulate your emotions, to give you worth, or to confirm your identity, then her role collapses. She may sense this shift long before you speak it loud. It appears in your calm, in your lack of urgency, in the way you no longer over-explain yourself. To her, this silence is louder than any argument. Jung warned that when we outsource our inner completeness to another person, we surrender authority over our own psyche. Narcissistic dynamics thrive on that surrender. But the moment you reclaim it, something irreversible happens. The power dynamic changes. You are no longer seeking approval, you are standing in self-possession. And here is the quiet truth she struggles to face. The more whole you become, the less control anyone has over you. When you stop needing someone to feel complete, you don't just free yourself from them. You return ownership of your life to yourself. At some point, the narcissistic woman begins to ask a question she never expected to ask: why aren't you reacting like before? This is not curiosity, it is alarm. For a narcissistic psyche, emotional reactions are currency. Anger, pleading, explanations, even pain. These are all forms of engagement that confirm influence. When those reactions disappear, something essential to her psychological balance goes missing. In Jungian terms, what has changed is not the relationship, but your participation in the projection. Earlier, you may have unconsciously accepted the role assigned to you, the one who reacts, explains, reassures, or defends. That role allowed her to avoid confronting her own inner emptiness. But when you withdraw emotionally, when you respond with calm or silence instead of intensity, the projection collapses. She is forced, even briefly, to face herself. This is why silence unsettles a narcissist more than confrontation. Confrontation still centers her. Silence removes her from the psychological stage. She may interpret this as cruelty or arrogance, but in reality, it is your nervous system finally returning to equilibrium. You are no longer regulated by her moods, her provocations, or her need for control. The absence of react. Tion is often mistaken for indifference. It is not. It is discernment. It is the moment you realize that not every emotional stimulus deserves a response, and not every conflict requires your energy. Jung believed maturity meant choosing consciousness over compulsion. When you stop reacting automatically, you step out of the unconscious pattern that once bound you. Here is the quiet power in that. Shift when you no longer react. You are no longer predictable. And what cannot be predicted cannot be controlled. Emotional self-mastery is not silence for her sake. It is clarity for yours. And once you discover that, you don't argue your way to freedom. You outgrow the need to react at all. There comes a moment when another unspoken question begins to haunt her. Do you see through me now? This is perhaps the most destabilizing question a narcissistic woman can face, because it threatens the very structure of her inner world. Narcissism depends on a carefully maintained image, not only presented to others, but believed by the self. When that image is seen clearly, without idealization, without fear. The illusion weakens. From a Jungian lens, this is the collapse of the persona. The persona is the mask we wear to navigate the world, and in narcissistic dynamics, that mask becomes rigid and overprotected. It is polished, defended, and constantly reinforced through admiration or emotional reactions. But once you recognize the patterns, manipulation, gaslighting, emotional inconsistency, the mask loses its grip. Awareness does what arguments never can. This is why a narcissistic woman may become uneasy around your clarity. You are no longer confused by mixed signals or pulled into circular conversations. You notice contradictions and no longer rush to explain them away. Your questions become fewer but sharper. In psychological terms, you have shifted from unconscious participation to conscious observation. Observation is dangerous to illusion. Jung believed that what remains unconscious controls us, but what is made conscious loses its compulsive power. When you see through the behavior, you are no longer controlled by it. She senses this shift not because you accuse her, but because you stop being emotionally entangled in the performance. The dynamic changes from involvement to awareness. What unsettles her most is that this awareness cannot be reversed. Once the pattern is seen, it cannot be unseen. The spell is broken, not through confrontation, but through comprehension. And here is the quiet power you carry forward. Clarity does not attack. It liberates. When you see clearly, you no longer need to defend yourself, because the truth is already doing the work for you. Beneath her words and behavior lies another persistent question. Am I still or in your eyes? This question is rarely spoken directly, yet it shapes much of the narcissistic dynamic. Narcissism is sustained by an internal hierarchy where she must remain above, more desirable, more intelligent, more significant. Your admiration once reinforced that hierarchy. But the moment it fades, the structure begins to crack. From a Jungian perspective, this sense of superiority is not genuine confidence, it is compensation. It protects a fragile self from confronting its own insecurity. When you idealize her, you unknowingly participate in that defense. You elevate her image so she does not have to face her own inner doubts. But when you stop doing that, when your gaze becomes neutral rather than admiring, the imbalance she relied on disappears. This is why a narcissistic man often reacts strongly to your indifference rather than your criticism. Criticism can still confirm importance. Indifference does not. When you no longer place her above yourself, you are not devaluing her. You are restoring equality, and equality feels threatening to a personality that survives on comparison and dominance. You may notice a subtle shift in how you relate. You no longer seek her approval or fear her disapproval. Her moods no longer define your emotional climate. In Jungian terms, you have withdrawn a projection of power and reclaimed it as part of your own psyche. What once seemed superior now appears simply human. This shift destabilizes her not because you have changed who she is, but because you have changed who she is to you. And that distinction matters. The narcissistic structure cannot survive without an audience that believes in its illusion. Here is the truth worth holding on to. The moment you stop placing someone above you, you step into your own authority. You don't need to diminish anyone to do this. You simply need to stand on equal ground and refuse to look up again. Finally, we arrive at the most revealing question of all, though it is often asked. In silence rather than words, will you ever come back? This question sits at the core of the narcissistic psyche because it touches the deepest assumption it holds, that people may leave temporarily but never permanently. To a narcissistic woman, return is not a sign of love, it is proof of dominance. It reassures her that no matter what happens, her influence remains intact. From a Jungian perspective, This expectation of return reflects an unresolved fear of abandonment paired with an unconscious belief in entitlement. The narcissistic self cannot tolerate the idea of being truly left, because that would force a confrontation with inner emptiness. If you come back, the illusion survives. If you do not, the illusion fractures. This is why, even after distance or apparent closure, there may be attempts to re-enter your life. These are not always dramatic. Sometimes they appear as nostalgia, curiosity, or casual concern. But psychologically, they serve a single purpose: to test whether the door is still open. Not to reconnect, but to confirm access. What changes everything is when you do not return emotionally, mentally, or energetically. You are not hostile. You are not reactive. You are simply no longer available in the way you once were. Jung would describe this as the completion of a psychological separation, the moment the unconscious bond dissolves. This is also where many people feel guilt. They confuse self-respect with cruelty. But refusing to return to a dynamic that diminished you is not an act against another. It is an act for your awaken individuation. And here is the final truth to carry with you. When you choose not to go back, you are not closing a chapter. You are ending a cycle. And the person who ends the cycle is the one who finally becomes free. Sooner or later, another question surfaces beneath the surface of her behavior. Have you moved on, emotionally? On the outside, this can appear like lingering attachment or unresolved feeling. But psychologically, it points to something else entirely. For a narcissistic woman, emotional separation is more threatening than physical distance. You can be gone and still emotionally available, and that is often enough. What unsettles her is the possibility that you are no longer psychologically reachable. From a Jungian perspective, narcissistic attachment is not about relationship. It is about psychic possession. Your emotions, your attention, your inner reactions functioned as extensions of her self-image. When you move on emotionally, you are not simply leaving a person, you are withdrawing energy from a shared unconscious pattern. And when that energy is no longer accessible, the pattern begins to dissolve. This is why the idea of your emotional freedom can trigger anxiety, suspicion, or sudden attempts at re-engagement. It is not jealousy in the traditional sense. It is the fear of losing access to a familiar source of validation. To a narcissistic psyche, someone who has emotionally moved on feels like a closed door, and closed doors provoke obsession because they deny control. Emotionally moving on does not always mean finding someone else. Often it means something far quieter and far more unsettling. Your inner world no longer revolves around her. Your thoughts are not anchored in anticipation or resentment. Your emotions are not pulled into old loops. You are present in your own life again. Jung spoke of liberation as the withdrawal of projections. When you reclaim your emotional energy, you reclaim your psychic autonomy. That is why this question is never really answered out loud. It is answered through your absence of longing, of fixation, of emotional availability. And here is the truth worth carrying forward. When you move on emotionally, you don't erase the past. You remove its power over your present. And that single shift is enough to change the entire dynamic of your life.